Right, folks, we're going to get started just so that I can go through some prefatory comments and the verbiage that is required for the Andrew Norman lecture. We're delighted this year to have Dr. Carl Jacoby join us as our Andrew Norman lecturer, but also there's an added bonus here, which he's also going to be co-presenting in some ways towards the end with Chip Williams, a descendant, I think I got it right, the great-grandnephew of the person at hand in this latest book. But first, the Andrew Norman. This guest lecture series, I always feel like I need a monocle when I read this. It's an endowment from the Andrew Norman Foundation in 1988, now 31 years, established an annual guest lecture for us in Southwest Studies, which brings, and I quote, distinguished men and women in the forefront of regional politics, environmental issues, education, culture, and arts to enhance the understanding of the communities of Colorado College and Colorado Springs about the Southwest. And one of those aspects is that you cannot understand the Southwest and the greater parts of the Southwest, northern Mexico, Southwest U.S., without a solid understanding of the historical events that have shaped the region. So we tack that on to environmental issues, education, culture, and the arts. And that's been a long and rich tradition ever since David Weber was the first historian to give a lecture here. As part of that series, and this has included people like Rodolfo Anaya, Frank Waters gave the first one, Ana Alonso, Enrique Lamadrid, Marcia Weisiger at Oregon. So it's a long and distinguished series. We're really lucky to have this and to be able to offer this sort of few days of intellectual life, not just for Southwest Studies, but hopefully for campus. Today's speaker is a professor of history at Columbia University. He's been there for how many years now? Is it 7 years, 6 years? Yeah, 6 years. Had previously taught at Brown University, where he also earned his undergraduate degree, and taught for 1 year, one memorable year apparently, at Oberlin College, small place on the shores of Lake Erie you may have heard about. He has devoted his career to understanding the ways in which the making of the United States intertwined with the unmaking of a variety of other societies, principally from Native American nations to the communities of northern Mexico and the ecologies upon which they rested. This latest work really is more a reflection of how this particular persona that we'll hear about straddled multiple boundaries, and not just geographic divisions between east and west in the U.S., but also north-south between Mexico and the U.S., and also reflects a different methodological kind of push and focus. So not so much about environmental history at the macro level across distributed areas in his first book, not so much about violence in a specific event in the late 1800s about an Apache massacre that stands in for the larger turmoil of Southwestern peoples as they tried and often failed to get along, but really a microcosm. So how can a single biographic book about a singular character who translated himself across borders quite well, as we'll hear, what does that have to teach us about contemporary notions of citizenship, nationhood, race, and what it means to have some version of identity that is fungible, tradable for some others? So I'm looking forward to this. This is really based on his latest book, The Strange Career of William Ellis, the Texas slave who became a Mexican millionaire, released just a few years ago from Norton in 2016. His prior books, which I was sort of hinting and alluding to, are Crimes Against Nature, published back in 2003, and also The Shadows at Dawn, also one of my favorite titles, A Borderlands Massacre and the Violence of History with Penguin back in 2008. So as someone who has crossed these ranging topics with environments, violence, and the notion of what do we learn from individuals, I'm looking forward to tonight's talk. So please help us join in and welcome Dr. Carl Jacoby and Chip Williams, who are here, and I'm delighted to have him here. So thanks for coming.
Thanks so much. That was a really too generous introduction. If you're interested at all, remember to ask me and Chip about Marcia Weisiger, who actually is, we didn't realize that she'd also spoken in this lecture series, but she has a connection to this particular project. I'll leave that there mysteriously for you right now. I wanted to start by highlighting the paradox that was at the heart of the book that I recently completed, and lots of people said I was sort of giving away the whole secret of the book in the subtitle. The Texas slave who became a Mexican millionaire, someone who was born enslaved in Texas and then reinvents himself, crosses the border, reinvents himself, as a Mexican. The paradox is that I was attempting to write the life story of someone who was trying to obscure all traces of their past, who was trying to make it impossible for someone to write their biography. History as a discipline values empiricism. This is research based on primary sources, yet that goal is in tension with the fact that the archives that preserve these primary sources are not neutral. They're in fact created with specific goals in mind to justify certain points of view and often to erase and obscure other perspectives. Empiricism suggests that we can know the past by studying primary sources. Archival theory, however, calls us into question by reminding us that the documentary record is always partial and distorted as a representation of the past. So to address this problem, like a lot of historians, I started with written documents in the archive, but eventually I came up against the limit of the written archive, and then I had to go outside of the archive and engage with other ways of recording the past that are less recognized. And I'll tell you how that happened, which will allow me to introduce our special guest, Chip Williams, who will be joining me for the question and answer session of the talk. So let me start with the archive. Way back in graduate school, one of my advisors knew that I was interested in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and so she suggested that I should write a short paper based on some State Department records that were at our library. And in many respects, this book took me about 10 years to write, and this whole process is sort of a cautionary tale about that short, easy, quick little research project that turns out to be anything but. What these State Department records were the records of consuls, U.S. consuls, and U.S. consuls were located in every major Mexican city in the north of Mexico, and they would send back weekly reports, and so it offered a very granular sense of what was going on in northern Mexico from a U.S. vantage point during this time period. And so I'm dealing with these, I'm just more or less flipping through at random through the pages of these reports, and I have to say they're pretty boring, most of them at first. They're just about coal exports and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden I turn the page and I tumble into all these documents from the year 1895 about an attempt to settle close to 1,000 African American sharecroppers from Alabama and Georgia on a hacienda in the state of Durango in northern Mexico, an hacienda called Tlahualilo. And several features of this episode immediately gripped my attention. The first is how it ruptured conventional understandings of migration between the U.S. and Mexico. Whenever we talk about immigration between the U.S. and Mexico, we tend to think about people from Mexico coming to the United States. At least as Americans, we think, of course, everyone wants to come here. But this crystallized for me this moment just 1 year before Plessy versus Ferguson, just 1 year before the solidification of Jim Crow in the South, when actually African Americans were looking across the border and seeing Mexico, not the United States, as the land of opportunity. And so there was this possibility, many people thought at the time, that this initial movement, which was about 1,000 African American sharecroppers, might actually blossom into something quite huge, which would actually transform the racial and economic landscape of both the American South, as it lost this important labor resource at the very least, and as they were incorporated into northern Mexico. Equally striking for me is how this melded two streams of colonization discourse. The first of these was rooted in the United States, and this was a way of thinking of the term colonization referred to in the United States context, at least, in terms of resettling African Americans on lands outside of the United States. It's typically associated with the antebellum period when the American Colonization Society was founded, but it continued into the late 19th century. You had figures like the Bishop Henry Turner, who believed that African Americans could only escape the oppressions of white supremacy in the United States by going outside of the United States, by having a nation that they could have significant political and economic control in it, particularly in Africa, which is where Bishop Turner was focused most of his attention. The second stream of the colonization discourse was the colonization discourse that existed within Mexico itself. When Mexicans spoke about colonization, they didn't speak about forcing people out of the country or encouraging them to move. What they spoke about was attracting skilled immigrants into the country, Mexico at the time thought about itself as underpopulated, needing more skilled immigrants. And so indeed, the hacienda in Durango, where these African Americans resettled, was called a colonia or colony, and in the Mexican press, when they spoke about these people, they referred to them as colonos or colonists. You see here, this is from a U.S. publication. You see that they actually refer to them as refugees, which is a quite interesting turn of phrase. There's this obvious complementarity between these two ways of thinking about colonization, with the United States thinking about people leaving and Mexico thinking about people coming in. Yet prior to this moment in 1895, no one had ever thought about bringing the two of them together. They'd existed in virtual isolation from one another. So I was wondering, who is it who thought actually there's a way of bringing, who knew enough to bring these two streams of colonization together and saw some new opportunity here and to set this unprecedented plan in motion. And this is a map from the period, and I particularly like it. It's a little bit disorienting, I suspect, for you. The thing that's most striking about it is that the border, which is really right here, is not the most obvious kind of, linear mark on the map. What's most obvious on the map is, of course, the north-south lines of the railroads. And so the railroad had breached the border in the 1880s, 1890s between the United States and Mexico, and all of a sudden these spaces that were very distant and hard to reach are in much more intimate contact than one another. And so it meant that actually you could come from Alabama all the way down to Durango in just a matter of days, which would have been a much more difficult trip earlier. References I was seeing in the archives referred to the man who was behind this colonization scheme in Mexico as variously as William Ellis, Guillermo Ellis, or Guillermo Eliseo. And according to whom he believed, he might be a Mexican, he might be a Cuban, or he might be, quote, an intelligent-looking mulatto from Texas. And so there was a lot of mystery swirling around him, and initially I wasn't able to resolve what was going on with this. And so in fact I set this whole project aside and went on to write some of the other books that Professor Perriman was referring to. At the same time, I had this inkling in my mind that there was something fascinating about this character and about this episode from 1895. Within Borderlands history, the figure of the border crosser has assumed special prominence, not as some odd marginal figure who's flitting between categories and nations, but really as the illustrative figure of the borderlands, the figure who, through their behavior, it demonstrates how the border operates in everyday lived experience. So after a while, years pass, and I end up coming back to this particular project. And in the interim, there had been a revolution in the way that one did research, which is to say this massive digitization of census records and of newspaper records, which allowed me to search for references to Guillermo Ellis, Guillermo Eliseo, William Ellis, whatever his name was, and try to trace him. Before, I'd had to do this all by flipping through microfilm, which was just really like mind-numbing and actually, I think, incredibly bad for your eyes. And so this was like a really nice change for me. There are a lot of William Ellises out there, and I did follow a lot of false trails. There was a William Ellis who was running around Hawaii, and I got very excited because sometimes people thought William Ellis was Hawaiian, but that William Ellis was not William Ellis, it turned out. But eventually I did find things that I thought were adding up, and I want to share some of these for you and sort of march through you some of the findings that I had. So the first of these would be this finding. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to try to make you read this, but as a historian, we love documents, so I had to show you the overall shot. This is the 1910 census, which was taken in New York City, and then I'm going to zero in on the line that's most important, and I tried to indicate it there with that pink point there. And so if you read across, there's a William Ellis. I'm sorry, I said New York City. He's living in Mount Vernon, New York, which is one of the first kind of fancy suburbs outside of New York at the time. If you read across there, you can see it's M for male, W for white. He's 45. He's married. He's been married 6 years. He's from Mexico, but then it says Spanish. He's from Mexico of Spanish descent. You can read across. And it says he emigrated in 1869 and that he's learned to speak English. Based on findings like this, I was then able to find documents like this one, which was the birth certificate for his firstborn son. This one is from New York City. He's born in New York City in 1904 when his parents are living at 300 Central Park West. That's quite an elite, fancy address in New York City. He's actually in a building that's sort of appropriate for someone who's a Latin American businessman. It was called the El Dorado building. And it's not surprising, I guess, that he's that, he's living in such a fancy building. As you see that on this birth certificate, he's listed as a broker and banker. And the birth certificate seemed to clarify some of the confusion I was having about his name here. As you see on the side here, it says Enrique Eliseo Jr. Oh, Guillermo Enrique Eliseo Jr. is his son's name, and then W.H. Ellis Jr. in parentheses there. It seems like probably his real name was Guillermo Enrique Eliseo, but for the convenience of his English-speaking acquaintances, he would often go by William Henry Ellis, hence some of the confusion I was having. Again, for our purposes, what's interesting is like the census, which records race, birth certificates also record race. And so you'll see here that where am I? I'm losing myself. Somewhere in here. Is that up here? White. The color of his child is white. Mother English, father Mexican. So far so good. But as I start to follow the trail backwards in time, I found out that I ended up not in Mexico at all, but actually across the border in Texas. And Guillermo Eliseo, the Mexican banker and broker, did not look all that Mexican at all. So if you look at him here in the 1880 census, and again, don't worry about this, but I just wanted to show you the entirety of it. If you go to the specific line, which again I've tried to indicate him here with this arrow, if you read across there, it's William, and then the next category is race, and you see that's MU for mulatto. And you see that if you read across, he's born in Texas, that's down here at the very end. He's born in Texas, and his parents are born in Kentucky, not in Mexico at all. And if the Guillermo Eliseo we encountered in that earlier birth certificate is a banker living on Central Park West, here it's much more prosaic. His father is listed as a warehouse man, basically a kind of glorified maintenance worker, and his grandmother, who's living with them down here, is listed as a washerwoman, and that's a very standard occupation for African American women at this time. It's something that they could do at home, cleaning other people's dirty laundry. If we go back in time, and don't worry, I'm not going to inflict all of the census data on you. If you go back in time, though, in the 1870 census, his father shows up as a shoemaker, and then if you go to the 1860 census, they don't appear by name at all, because at that point they're enslaved, and enslaved people are treated as property, not as persons, so they're just shown as peoples of certain age living in the household of a white enslaver. So it had seemed to me, based on this, or what I thought I was seeing, because I wasn't sure I was following the right William Ellis here, but what I thought I was seeing is something like a real-life Great Gatsby, a young man from a small town, humble background, who changed his name and managed to find tremendous financial success in New York City. But the only way I realized I was going to feel comfortable making this argument and feel that I had the evidence that I needed was if I was able to track down some of his relatives in the hopes that they could confirm what I thought I was seeing, and that actually this William Ellis that I was finding in Victoria, Texas, was the same William Ellis who was then later running around New York City and then later involved in the effort to colonize African Americans in northern Mexico. So this is one of the things where the written archive itself, the official archive, could not solve the problem that I was having. I'm not going to bore you with all the details about how I did this, but it basically involved tracing the lineage of William Ellis's siblings and finding out where his siblings were located. Eventually, I tracked down William Ellis's grandnieces, who were descended from his sister, who had, when I discovered them, were living in Los Angeles. And they did indeed confirm that what I thought I was seeing in the archive was correct, that William Ellis, the William Ellis born in Victoria, Texas, was the figure who later reinvented himself as Guillermo Eliseo in New York City. He was known to them as Uncle Willie, and they shared one of the first things they shared with me was this rather spectacular picture, which had hung in their household of, as they called him, Uncle Willie. And they were, I felt I had to get their permission to write the book, but they were supportive of me writing this particular book. And so today, Chip Williams, who is William Ellis's great-grandnephew, will be joining me on stage for the question and answer session. One sort of really fascinating link. So as a child, Chip knew his great-aunt Belle, who was William Ellis's sister. Great-great-aunt Belle? I'm probably missing.
She was actually listed on that census.
On that census. So she's appearing on the census there. So he knew someone who knew William Ellis. There's 1 degree of separation between Chip and William Ellis, not to mention, of course, all the family stories. So it's really kind of profound, I think. It was really quite profound for me. This person I'd been chasing like a phantom through the archives and didn't really even know particularly what he looked like, and we'll get to that in a second, to actually find living, breathing people who had this really profound, deep connection with him. Doing history in this way was somewhat new for me, working with living descendants, because I'm a 19th century historian. One thing I like about 19th century history is usually the people I write about are dead. They can't really, complain or talk back to whatever interpretation I want to do. But here I realized that in a way that I thought was really productive and fascinating, that I was involved in a dialogue with the family about William Ellis and his life. And they actually had a lot. It wasn't simply me coming as a historian and teaching them, that actually they had a lot to teach me about both the specifics of his life and how to interpret it. Some of our most intensive discussions concerned about how best to describe William Ellis's behavior, his reinvention of himself as Guillermo Eliseo. My original impulse had been to describe this behavior unproblematically as passing, but this was something that Chip and his family actually felt was not perhaps the best term to be using. For them, passing involved a complete and traumatic separation between someone and their birth family. And the term passing itself is very revealing. Passing is used in the vernacular as someone who's African American who is passing for white, but passing also means to die, right? And so when you say he passed, you're saying that someone is experiencing a social death of sorts, right? And so this very much is what they didn't think that William Ellis had done, that he remained connected to the lives of his family, to his nieces and nephews, which is why they knew so much about him, and that he actually helped the family financially throughout his life. And of course, staying in touch with his family like this was risky, and in some ways I think the reason I know about him is that he took more risks than someone who tried to just disappear completely into their new identity. What I thought was really interesting, and here's another family photo, is when he would get together with his family members, because family members are the people, if you're trying to, let's say, reinvent yourself, family members are the one who might betray the reality of your background, right? And so you have to be very careful about how you interact with them. And so when William Ellis would do this, so here's William Ellis up here, this is his father, Charles, and then two of William Ellis's children. When he got together with them, if you see this, they're doing it down in Mexico City. They're trying to do it outside of the United States, outside of where they might be seen by the white gaze. One other sort of interesting piece of evidence about this as well. So there is all this correspondence, William Ellis writing back to his family. His mother dies sort of tragically early, and you see this note here saying to his father, saying, please put some, I remember my mom, please put some flowers on her grave. Again, the family really thought this indicated his deep sort of emotional connections to the family. And when Chip and I were in San Antonio last year, I want to say, we actually went and found the grave that he was referring to here in that particular telegram. And that was another really powerful moment for us to think about that particular space that William Ellis had thought about so much. So in the book, as I thought about how to avoid making passing to be the central analytic for Ellis's behavior, I experimented with a variety of alternative frames, the foremost of which would be the figure of the trickster from African American folklore. This is something that's used a lot in literary criticism of African American literature. The trickster serves in African American folklore as both hero and anti-hero. He breaks the rules, but in breaking the rules shows where the main sort of fault lines in any particular society exist. I think in retrospect, the trickster metaphor more or less accomplishes what I hoped it would, but I don't think it's something that was universally loved by everyone in Chip's family, who I think some of them thought it seemed perhaps a little bit pejorative. That wasn't my intention with it, but that was one possible misreading of it, I think. And one of the things they pointed out about this is that if there is any sort of crime that's being committed here, it's not William Ellis misrepresenting himself. The real larger crime is the crime of white supremacy, which forced William Ellis to try to engage in these sorts of forms of reinvention in the first place. And so if I were to venture any sort of self-critique at this point, which has now been 3 years since the book came out, it's that I feel like I should have, in retrospect, listened to Chip's family even a little more deeply than I should, that I think it would have been really interesting in the book to try to not import the trickster term, not use passing, not import the trickster term from African American literary criticism, but try to think about, is there a term that we could have come up ourselves that would have described this reality of someone who crosses not from black to white, but from black to Mexican, which I think is really different, and who doesn't completely vanish into their new identity, but maintains some sort of linkage with their home community and a certain vision of black liberation. What I found really fascinating about the case of William Ellis is that his reinvention, let's call it that, didn't involve simply questions of phenotype, which is what we normally think about, I think, with passing, but a variety of other things: language, dress, behavior. Above all, in presenting himself as Mexican, as Ellis did, it involved not simply crossing a racial line, but also a class line as well. He's not trying to convince people that he's a Mexican peon. He's trying to convince people that he's a member of the upper class Mexican city elite, that he is a chilango. And so his reinvention needs to be understood as a part of the larger story of self-shaping under capitalism. In part, it's about envisioning yourself as a self-maximizing agent seeking individual advantage, but it's also about how the figure of the capitalist, which is embedded with certain gender and racial assumptions, allows someone like Ellis to distance himself from popular perceptions of what it meant to be African American and what African Americans could and should be doing. So what I wanted to share with you at this point is just some of the images that exist of Ellis. I showed you one of the first photos, but he's a very popular figure in the press, and so there's a lot of images in the press that you see of him. And what I find quite striking is how different people seem to have different perceptions of him. So this is a drawing here. He looks a little bit like a Teddy Roosevelt to me in this particular one. Here's another one where he looks almost like a movie star, very suave. This is a drawing of him. And this one, he looks a lot like, I think, the Monopoly Man. And I don't think that's a little bit of a joke, but it's serious in the sense that the Monopoly Man is supposed to be a caricature of the capitalist, right? And so William Ellis is, I think, embracing that fully, and he's got everything from the suit to the top hat and the cane and everything else. There's another variation of this. Another variation of this. Again with the top hat and the cane. Here's one, the photo, which is on the front of the book, and here you see in real life he does have the top hat and the cane. So this is a picture that the family in Mexico sent to me. Here's another one, which I think is fascinating, how he's sort of using the chair as a prop. Again, it's a very regal chair, which suggests a certain kind of stature just in the kind of furniture and self-presentation. And this is sort of a more candid photo. I think it's hard for me. I'd be curious to get your feedback in the question and answer session. It's hard for me, of course, knowing his history and knowing his background, but I look at this photo here, and to be honest, he looks fairly African-American to me. And I'm really somewhat amazed that someone who could at times look like that was often seen by the American society as looking something more like this. Now, one reason so many whites in the United States were so willing to believe that William Ellis, the ex-slave, was actually Guillermo Eliseo, the wealthy Mexican banker, is that he understood how to play to his audience's deepest desires. Much of the Gilded Age's booming consumer economy depended on one way or another on raw materials from Mexico. This is a period of electrification, and for the copper wires, for telephone wires and electric wires, all this copper came predominantly from Mexico. This is the period when the car has been invented, and the rubber, which at that time is actually a plant sap, the rubber comes from Mexico. Much of the petroleum for the cars comes from Mexico. This is a period when you're beginning to get junk food, the great American invention of junk food. And so the chicle for chewing gum comes from Mexico, the chocolate and vanilla for chocolate and vanilla ice cream, all of that comes from Mexico as well. And so all this makes Mexico an object of fascination for American capitalists and made Guillermo Eliseo a useful figure to know, as he was someone who could facilitate U.S. investment south of the border. Under these circumstances, no one really wanted to dig too deeply underneath the facade that William Ellis had created for himself. And this enabled Ellis to become arguably the first African American on Wall Street with an office next to J.P. Morgan, the preeminent investment bank of the era, even if, of course, most people at the time did not know about his African American background. So here's a photo of his office there on Wall Street, and you can see how it talks about Mexican and Cuban, what does that say there? Investments. And I always say this, I mean, this is always what's heartbreaking to me as a historian, is simply looking at all those books and records that are in his office and assuming they all got thrown out at some point, and who knows what happened to them, and all the possible additional facets of his life story that I could explain if those had ever made their way into some sort of archive. Now, ironically, while he was in Mexico, Ellis did not portray himself as a Mexican. There's really no advantage to saying you're Mexican in Mexico when there's lots of other Mexicans there. Particularly during the Porfiriato, there was a certain cachet to being an American, and so he presented himself as an American south of the border, and sometimes intimated that he was the illegitimate, unrecognized son of Collis P. Huntington, who's one of the big railroad entrepreneurs, built the Transcontinental Railroad, and involved in his father's railroad ventures in Mexico. This was another big American investment in Mexico, was building the railroads in Mexico. So the interesting thing here is that Ellis isn't trying to completely erase boundaries and drain them of meaning as much as he's trying to reinvent them so that they serve his own purposes. He grasps that by being as a foreigner in whatever nation he happened to inhabit at the particular moment, he could step outside of the prevailing racial regime. It's a very clever move, but I also think it must have been a lonely one, because it meant that he was the perpetual outsider, never truly at home in either country. Ellis's status as a perpetual outsider echoed the situation of peoples of African descent in both the U.S. and Mexico at this time. Both the U.S. and Mexico experienced existential crises in the mid-19th century. For the United States, this would be the Civil War. For Mexico, this would be the War of Reform, and then the closely following on its heels, the French invasion and intervention. In the aftermath of these crises, each country went through a parallel process of national reinvention. In the United States, this is Reconstruction. In Mexico, this is a Porfiriato. They start just 1 year apart from one another. And in trying to create more, what they saw is that this need to create a more coherent nation out of a diverse human community, both the U.S. and Mexico relied upon ideas of race, but in quite distinct ways. In the U.S., policymakers tried to create ever more fine, exact categories of racial difference, segregating and stigmatizing African Americans and denying them their civil rights as citizens. In Mexico, there was a growing celebration of this idea of mestizaje, or mixing. The mestizo, however, came to be defined as a mixture of Spanish and Indian, and this ended up erasing the significant Afro-Mexicano presence that had existed in Mexico ever since the very earliest days of the colonial period. In both countries, in other words, peoples of African descent defined what would be the parameters, the outside limits of national belonging, but they did so in different ways. In the United States through exclusion, and in Mexico through erasure. The fact that such different ideas of race took shape across the border from one another in the late 19th century was no accident, but in fact part of a self-conscious effort by both countries to differentiate their national projects from one another. During Reconstruction, many whites in the United States used Mexico's apparent political instability to argue against political and social equality for the United States' recently liberated slaves. Mexico, in turn, looked north and saw the violence of Reconstruction, the lynching, all of that, and decided that and proclaimed that it did not have the racism that existed in the United States. It did not have the ideas of race that existed in the United States. So as neighboring North American republics, the U.S. and Mexico found each other to be a potent mirror, a mirror in which they could glimpse the other, and in so doing, to glimpse themselves as well, in portraying itself as a white nation, unlike what it regularly called mongrel Mexico. The U.S. obscured the existence of its many non-white residents, not to mention the racial mixing and passing that rendered the whole idea of a pure white race sort of untenable from the very beginning. And in casting itself as a mestizo nation of Spanish and Indian origin, unmarred by the slavery that had fueled the violent land grabs of its northern neighbor, Mexico erased the presence of its considerable Afro-Mexicano population. And this process of transborder differentiation was not something only that William Ellis, in a way, benefited from, but it's something that he actually, or it's something that he tried to use to his own ends. It's something that he, in fact, set in motion as the Gilded Age's leading advocate of African American migration to Mexico. So things like this 1895 migration of African American sharecroppers to Mexico was just one of his several attempts that he had to settle African Americans in Mexico, and it triggered very extensive debates in Mexico about the place or sort of the desirability or not of peoples of African descent being citizens of Mexico. This situation also points to the great paradox at the heart of William Ellis's experience. Ellis sought to use the borderline to undermine the color line, yet even as he searched for new horizons outside of a white supremacist United States, for himself and other African Americans, the realm where he found the greatest opportunity was in the United States' expanding commercial empire overseas, its informal empire. And as a result, Ellis was never able to articulate a full critique of American empire, particularly its exploitative economic relationships. Instead, in Mexico, he became closely allied with members of the Porfirian elite. He even went so far as to name one of his children Porfirio Diaz Ellis. And then when the Mexican Revolution came, and with it an attack on American investment in Mexico, this completely upended the life that William Ellis had built for himself south of the border. Ellis died penniless in 1923, having lost all his wealth in the Mexican Revolution. When he passed away, the New York Times and other mainstream newspapers ran obituaries invoking the persona of the wealthy Latin American businessman that Ellis had spent so much of his life so carefully constructing and cultivating. A few days later, however, the New York Age and the rest of the black press abandoned the discretion they long followed in discussing Ellis and revealed to their readers that this, quote, financial genius was, in fact, quote, a colored man. So the subtext here is they knew all along, they had known for years that he was African American, but when he was alive, they had carefully protected his secret, but once he's dead, they felt comfortable sharing it with the world and claiming him as part of the African American community and claiming his accomplishments as part of the African American community. This outing of as it were, of William Ellis's quote-unquote true identity highlights the predominant way of thinking about passing that operated in the Gilded Age, the idea that one possesses a single true identity and that passing involved the adopting of a counterfeit, invented fake identity. I'd urge us, though, to sort of be a little cautious about such an impulse. I think in the same way that Borderlands history can help us to denaturalize the nation state and see that that's not the only way of organizing space and people, can also help us to denaturalize the concept of race. I think that rather than attempting the ultimately fruitless exercise of parsing identity into the real and contrived, we need to recognize instead that race is a fiction, albeit a fiction with all too much presence in the real world. Within such a context, William Ellis's adoption of the alternative persona of Guillermo Eliseo is best thought of as not a movement between the real and the contrived, but rather between two equally constructed performative identities, each invoking particular historical circumstances. The figure of William Ellis, Guillermo Eliseo, I sometimes wonder what exactly I should be calling him, attained much of his power from the fact that the U.S.-Mexico border delineated not only the boundary between two nation-states, but also two racial regimes. When Langston Hughes crossed the border from El Paso to Ciudad Juarez in the early 20th century, he noted with amazement the difference in racial status that just a short journey in space could produce. He wrote, "It was strange to find that just by stepping across an invisible line into Mexico, a Negro could buy a beer in any bar, sit anywhere in the movies, or eat in any restaurant. So suddenly did Jim Crow disappear." Conversely, the most fraught moment for Ellis often was when he was crossing the border in the opposite direction, when he had to switch between his personas of William Ellis and Guillermo Eliseo. He often made this trip via first-class Pullman train from Mexico City. But then when you cross in the border here, and you see this is Eagle Pass where you often cross through. The train's going the wrong way here for us. It's going from Eagle Pass into Mexico. But once you cross the border into Texas, there was a reshuffling of all the passengers on the train, and people who are non-white had to go sit in the colored section of the train, because Mexico, of course, had no formal segregation, but the railroads in Texas were, of course, segregated. So crossing the border involves also an issue about not only your personal identity, but your racial identity when you cross. Following Ellis's death, these different racial regimes would map themselves onto Ellis's own family. Ellis's widow and children relocated to Mexico after his demise, eventually losing touch with the U.S. side of the family until after almost a century of separation, I reintroduced them just a few years ago, setting in motion a transborder family reunion. So we've actually done some talks together this is at UCLA. So there's, of course, yours truly. This is the Mexican side of the family there. There's Chip's mom, and Chip's aunts, Fanny and Susie. So Ellis's grandson, which is Peter right here, there we are, Peter. Ellis's grandson knew that his grandfather was American, but he did not know that his grandfather was African American until I explained it to him in Spanish during one of our early phone calls that we had. And I wanted, at some point eventually, then I did an oral history with him about this whole experience. And I asked him about what it was like to discover that actually his grandfather was African American. And I want to close with his response, which encapsulates one of the central points of my project. So I asked him, so what is it? How did it do? What did it mean for you to find out that your grandfather was African American? He said, well, it didn't actually mean particularly much for me, in the sense that in Mexico we think about ourselves as mestizo, which means mixed, and I always knew that I was mestizo and mixed. I'm now more mixed than I realized, in the sense that I also have African American ancestry, but I'm still mestizo. It doesn't really change my sense of self. In contrast, in the United States, the prevailing logic still is the one-drop law. And in fact, it's interesting, the one-drop law is really incorporated into law right around the time when William Ellis dies in 1923. And if you did not previously identify as African American, to discover that you had African American ancestry could be quite transformative. Because in the American racial imaginary, blackness tends to trump other forms of ancestry. And certainly in the Jim Crow period, if you had any African American ancestry at all, you were considered black. So it's the same family. You can even notice certain family resemblances. Chip and I both think that he and Peter look a fair amount like one another. Yet the Mexican side of the family identifies as mestizo, while the U.S. side of the family identifies as African American. It's not that one definition is one side of the family is right and one side's wrong, that one definition is right, one side is wrong. They're both right given the particular side of the border that they happen to grow up on. But it's only by following William Ellis on his journeys back and forth across the borderline that we can begin to grasp how the color line took on the unique contours that it manifested in the U.S. and Mexico alike. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to taking some questions from you. We have to look at. Do you want to look at this, or do you want to just turn it off? You can keep it up there. So we just need a brave soul to start us off with some questions.
You mentioned on one of the census things, it mentioned that he was a Spanish person living in Mexico. Did you get into that at all? I mean, I've lived in New Mexico some, and I haven't spent that much time in Mexico itself, but I know that there is sort of a thing, the pride of being Spanish and not mestizo, sort of.
Yeah, I think that was part of his effort to cast himself as an upper class Mexican, and so that the best way to do that is present yourself as a highly Europeanized Mexican, right? And so I think that's why he's invoking the Spanish ancestry in that particular case.
Perception is, we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but also identity. People see what they want to see, as Carl brought up earlier. And Uncle Willie was very clearly a master at casting a representation of himself and convincing people of that. And I think that's just part and parcel to his persona and his reinvention, that he was able to have people believe that he was a Spaniard. I mean, you saw his picture, but there was... And again, Carl also brought up that, people in New York didn't necessarily know what a Mexican looked like. They were so far removed from Mexico. How much did they know what a Spaniard looked like? I mean, sometimes Mexican and Spanish, they're sort of interchanged, depending on, I know back in the 60s and sometimes in the 70s, some Mexican friends called themselves Spanish, So there's that play of identity in there as well.
Yes.
So I have a story about Ethiopia.
All right, the story about Ethiopia. That's for Chip. Okay.
So growing up in my family, we have a kind of look. And my grandmother used to think that possibly our African ancestry was from Ethiopia because of our eyes and a certain phenotype that we have. And also there was the knowledge that Uncle Willie had traveled to Ethiopia and had met King Menelik, right? And had this entire life there. So Ethiopia has loomed large in my family story as a possible place of origin, and then also this connection through Uncle Willie. And I happen to love Ethiopian food, too. So years ago, I worked for an organization called Tree People, and we did urban reforestation projects in Los Angeles. And on this particular day, I had been planting trees in a neighborhood adjacent to Beverly Hills. And after that long day of tree planting, I was very hungry, and I said, you know what, I'm going to go to Little Ethiopia, and I'm going to have the veggie platter. And I'm walking up the street, and I noticed a little gift shop for the first time. On my way to the restaurant, there was a little Ethiopian gift shop that I had never seen before, and I decided to step in. And the shopkeeper was sitting right at the door at one of the showcases, and she had a big book just open in front of her. And she looked engrossed in the book, and she didn't even acknowledge me when I walked in. So I walked in and I looked at the Ethiopian fabrics and the crucifixes and some other jewelry and whatnot. I made my round, and then as I was exiting, she looked up and she said something in Amharic to me. And I said, "I'm sorry, I'm not Ethiopian, I'm American." And she said, "Oh, you look so Ethiopian, I thought you were one of us." And I said, "No, I'm not Ethiopian, but my great-great-uncle traveled to Ethiopia and he met King Menelik." And she looked at me and she said, "He wasn't that wealthy African American, was he?" And I said, "Yeah, he was." And she said, "I'm reading the history of King Menelik right now. He was on this other," and she flipped back 3 or 4 pages and she said, "William Ellis." And I said, "Yes, that's my great-great-uncle." So that was a really wonderful connection for me and my family to learn that he was actually in Ethiopian history books. And I have since found him in other history books and books about the relationship between the United States and Ethiopia. And for me, that was the beginning of this relationship because it sort of foreshadowed Carl coming into our lives. Anyone else? I want to say something. I was thinking about it before I forget it. As Carl was showing the telegraph that Uncle Willie wrote to his father saying, "Please put flowers on Mama's grave," I went back to the cemetery in the spring of this year, and I laid flowers on her grave. I just felt called to do that. I just wanted to share that.
You specifically asked us to ask you about Marshall Weisiger. So what is an environmental
yes.
historian?
I'll start and Chip. So one of the first questions I asked when I first met Chip's family is a somewhat delicate question, but it was important, is what was the name of the plantation that your ancestors was enslaved on? What was the family that had enslaved your family? Because if you use the census records, they just show little tick marks for there's an African American of this gender and this age, but they don't have names, so there's no way to really tell. I knew that he lived in Victoria, but there's a lot of slave owners in Victoria, so I did not know which family had been the enslavers. And they said it was a family called Wiziger, is what they told me. And I said, "How do you spell that?" Wizzzeker, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a wedding with, my family is an old Los Angeles family. My great-grandfather moved to Los Angeles over 100 years ago. And my mother and aunts were raised there, very much a part of Black Los Angeles. And I have a friend from that connection here tonight. And so there's this big wedding of sort of upper middle class Black Los Angeles. And there is a woman, an elderly woman, sitting with my aunt. And Susie says, "Chip, come here. I want to introduce you to someone. This is cousin so-and-so. And cousin so-and-so's parents and our people were on the Wiziger plantation together." And so I said, "The Wiziger plantation." And that sounds like Whitaker, but it's Wiziger, So I was like, "Oh, how do you spell that?" And I once we had Google at our fingertips, I tried every kind of spelling. It never occurred to me it was a German name.
So to follow up on this, eventually I start looking through the historical records for Victoria. I can't find a Wiziger, but I find Weisiger. And I eventually discover, too, that in Texas, because they always say things, can I say this, Santiago? There are interesting pronunciations in Texas. The Guadalupe River that runs through Victoria is the Guadalupe River, and the Weisiger family is the Wiziger family in Texas. And Marcia Weisiger is a very well-known historian, and I contact her, and I say, would this be part of your, it's kind of another indelicate question, would this be part of your family? And it is part of her family, that Joseph Wiziger, who moves down to, from Kentucky to Texas, that that's also her great-great-great whatever grandfather. So the virtue to this is that she was then able to help us establish connections with the Wisiger family in Victoria, because I felt coming in as an outsider with no connections, wanting to ask them about slavery would be very difficult. But Marcia was very, to her, in credit to her, you can't choose your ancestors, but she was very upfront about this history and trying to help us get in. And so we actually, she was able to get us onto the Wisiger plantation down in Victoria, which was a really, a powerful experience, very, very profound. But it was there's been these weird connections in the project, which is to say, Chip and I have at various moments lived very close to one another without knowing each other. And I've known Marcia Wisiger, because she's another very prominent historian in my field, for years without realizing that there was this other connection that was going on. And I think it's a very interesting parable for us about the ways that often there are all these hidden connections that for all I know, I actually saw Chip when I just didn't really grasp the importance of who I was seeing earlier. There are these connections that we share we often don't know, and history can actually help us to understand these connections that we have with each other and the sort of deep foundations of these connections.
Also, with a nod to technology, I'd like to say that when Carl revealed to us that it was Weissiger, after we had that meeting, I went straight to Facebook and I put in Weisiger and Victoria, Texas. And there are so many people with that name living in that area. And I sent out questions to a number of them. And Marcia was not from the Victoria area, but she was someone, I saw her, and I sent a message to her, and she responded to me. And the next time she came to the Huntington, we met, my mother and my aunts and I met her at Pete's Coffee. And it was just wonderful connections, yeah. Yes?
I'm wondering if you might share a little bit about the stories that were told in your family about William Ellis, and then how your family received Carl when he called.
Well, this pretty much, you've heard a lot of the stories through the presentation. We knew, well, his wife Maud, for one. They presented her as a descendant of English aristocracy, right? And so we saw her picture. We had a picture of her with the boys, and we were like, "Oh wow, we're related to English aristocracy." And and then Carl had to burst that bubble. So there was that. My grandmother was a classically trained pianist, and she went to Juilliard for a period of time and stayed with Uncle Willie and Maud in Mount Vernon. So she had stories of her time with them. She also, phenotypically, there's a story that I just learned from my Aunt Susie. My grandmother went back to Texas to sell some property, and she was talking to someone, like maybe the property manager, someone they had hired at long distance to manage the property. And she showed up and addressed him about the property, and he said, "Oh, some inwards in California own this property," directly to her face, not recognizing. So it was safe for her for William Ellis's persona, for her to be there because she had this other look herself. He took gifts to King Menelik. We learned about that. I think he presented King Menelik with a beautiful gun, or else, yeah, saddle and other things. We have postcards from Djibouti, and we have letters that he had written to Aunt Belle, who we talked about earlier, who I knew as a boy. She married someone that Uncle Willie did not approve of, and he wrote lots of letters about who is that rascal that make sure that he's taking care of my little sister and whatnot. Stories like that, that he always cared for his family. No matter where he was traveling, he stayed in touch by telegraph and writing letters. He signed with love, your boy, Willie, So that connection was always there. And also there was one of the feelings about passing was just as Carl said, he was engaged in the black community, but incognito. So he cared, he had his foot or like a toe still involved. He did not pass entirely into another world. And that was something that gave us, a sense of like this guy was really on the up and up, and doing his thing. We also have this pride in him in that, with Jim Crow being what it was, this man had motivation, he had a vision for life, he had a lot of can-do, and he did not let the social constructs around him prevent him from doing as much as he could with his life. I mean, in some of the talks that we've given, people have looked at him as like, well, like he's crooked. He was fooling people, deceiving people, but he was fighting like that flower that's trying to get through the concrete. He wanted to thrive. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he wanted to self-actualize, and he did.
One small thing which was interesting for me as a historian is there were certain stories that the family had preserved incredibly well. So the interactions with King Menelik, for instance, there are other things that they didn't know about or hadn't talked about. So if you've read the book, you'll notice there's this, William Ellis might have murdered someone, potentially pushing them overboard at sea. And that was a story that the family did not know about and did not talk about. And then this is where I felt a little bit like a spoil sport as a historian. So the family, William Ellis marries a white woman, which I think is intentional in part because he wanted to have children. And if you're involved in this passing or self-reinvention, you have to be very careful when you have children because you don't know what they're going to look like, and that could sort of reveal your whole secret. And he marries this white woman, and he tells everyone quite loudly that she's, as Chip was saying, of minor British royalty. It turns out that she actually grew up in Jersey City, that she's actually involved in her own reinvention in the sense of, portraying herself as minor royalty or minor nobility rather than just being a working class girl from Jersey City. So I felt a little bad as a historian, kind of puncturing those family stories. Karen did ask about what it was like to have a historian all of a sudden intrude into your life, so you might want to answer a little bit about that.
I guess I got carried away with the other part. It was, frankly, one of the most beautiful surprises out of nowhere. Sort of like, my feeling is I'm a very spiritually oriented person, and I feel like our ancestors made contact with us through Carl. And it has unfolded this whole thing for me in terms of genealogical research and getting in touch with my roots. Carl was very respectful. He made first contact with my mother. I think you read an obituary. You learned about.
Yeah, but then I worked.
That's right. But my mother got off the phone and she said, "You won't believe someone just called me and asked about Uncle Willie. And he's been doing this research," and we were just mystified, like, where did this come from? And, we wanted to meet him. We wanted to learn what kind of research do you have? So he was immediately welcomed, because this figure of Uncle Willie is, like, in the family, iconic, this illustrious person. And we have these anecdotes, but not the full picture. And Carl was able to weave everything that we had together into a whole, which gave a greater sense of wholeness to our family in that respect. And then also, my hope was that I hope this man in his research can find our relatives in Mexico. And he did. And we've had a wonderful reunion, and we're all friends, and we spend time together. So he was quite welcome, quite welcome.
I would say I feel very lucky because you know, I'm doing this research. You don't know what kind of people you'll find at the end of the research, and they couldn't have been a more lovely, welcoming set of people. And the other thing, from my perspective as a historian, is they were the ideal family to encounter because, particularly, I mean, your Aunt Susie knows all the stories, and your Aunt Fanny has kept all the papers and all the photos, and so it's much better documented than, for instance, my own family. If someone were to show up and ask me about my great-granduncle, I have almost nothing about them. And they actually had this whole sort of family archive that they had kept very carefully. And so that was just a wonderful thing. The one very funny thing about this, one of the first articles I wrote about William Ellis, I wrote when I was on fellowship at the Huntington Library. And then when I finally tracked down Chip's family, they end up living just a few miles from the Huntington Library. And I was like, I can't believe I was there. I was working on this. I was sitting in the Huntington going, where is this guy's family? And all along they were just, you know, about a mile down the road. Other questions?
I'd like to add to that not only was Carl welcomed into our family, Carl and Marie and Jay are members of the extended family at this point. We've grown close and really enjoy each other's company. It's a family relationship, I feel, at this point.
I actually know more about Chip's family than I do about my family. I've actually started to do family research of my own because I feel like I need to keep up with Chip's family because I didn't know very much. And in many ways, it's very similar in the sense that there are family stories that have been, I won't bore you with them, but there's family stories that have been passed down to me, which as I do the historical research, I realize are quite different than the reality of what happened in my own family. Yeah.
Kind of reminds us of the question the student asked you this morning. What did you learn about yourself while investigating? You know, these other families that you don't know as much about yourself.
Yes, I think that's a good way. I didn't have a good answer at the time, but yes, I did. I became acutely aware of how little I knew about my own family, and it's actually an odd. In the process of doing this, I acquired a lot of respect for genealogists, which I'd always thought were, when you go to the National Archives to do research, the genealogists are kind of hogging all the microfilm machines, and they're kind of they were annoying me. But I actually realized that I had to work with genealogists to track down Chip's family because actually I hit dead ends that I couldn't figure my way out of, and I realized I had a lot of respect for it, and I also have a lot of respect for the sense that by tracing family history, which is in essence what I'm doing in this particular book, you can really reveal the whole sort of history of the borderlands of the United States and Mexico in a single family. And I think actually every family has a really fascinating story to tell. It's that we often don't know what that story is because we lose sight of it.
I'd like to also say that you know, Carl mentioned that we were able to go onto the Weiser Group property in Victoria, and that was a very powerful experience. And for me, you know, I posted lots of photographs. It was really beautiful land with just flowers and so many dragonflies and darting swallows and armadillos and deer darting here and there in a river, and 600-year-old oak trees. And it was just overwhelmingly beautiful to feel that my great-grandmother and grandfather walked under this tree. I'm sure Uncle Willie sat at the riverbank and threw stones in that river. And when I shared the story that I had visited the land where my family had been pre-emancipation, a number of people said, "Oh man, how did you feel? Were you angry? Oh man, I'm sorry, man, that must have been really, really..." And the interesting thing is, I did not connect with that narrative. what I connected with was my family. There's a really beautiful, I think it was a middle school teacher or an elementary school teacher who wrote, "They did not take slaves from Africa. They took potters, they took teachers, they took architects, they took, medicine men, and made them slaves." And that is what I connected to. I connected to the humanity of my people who lived on this land, and the beauty of the land spoke to me. And it was healing in that respect, because it wasn't about that painful narrative. It was about connecting to where I came from. So I just wanted to share that.
Good place to end, but thank you.
Okay.
No, thanks, everyone. Really appreciated your attention. Thanks. So incidentally, I do believe there are books for sale in the lobby, and I'm only saying this because this is a great opportunity to have William Ellis's great-grandnephew sign your book, which is really rare. Someone who, knew someone who knew William Ellis. So just think about that.